It's pretty clear I'm not going to get a chance to rest today, despite only having had about 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep. So, what the fuck? Already did a live stream earlier today, and one last night, which is why I was up late. But I've been trying to do 2 videos a day, so what the hell? This is easier than trying to edit or write or anything when your head isn't on straight. Are role-playing games a mature medium? I think I mentioned this in the inappropriate characters thing last night, but RPGs haven't been around as long as comics, but comics, mainstream comics, really became kind of adult in the 1980s. That was when there was kind of an overcoming of the Comics Code authorities. It was after about 40 years is when comics began dealing with adult, mature, difficult subjects. The touchstone was probably Watchmen. That's always name dropped when people write the eternal article, comics grow up, which seems to happen forever. And you know, that has superheroes in a slightly more realistic world in a lot of ways, in which the human interactions are more understandable, where the Golden Age hero gets beaten to death by punks coming into his apartment, where the flashback to the comedian with Miss Jupiter fairly graphically depicts a rape and so on. And Moore's work on that is going to stand the test of time as a classic, and many others are. He treated these topics with absolute seriousness and gravitas, at least in that book. He hasn't necessarily in others, but that's okay too. So if comics are an adult medium, are role-playing games? That's the question that interests me. When we kind of played at being grown up, at being adults in the 90s with a series of horror games, you know, the World of Darkness, Cult, just like there was that kind of age of comics, of the dark, gritty hero, we had the same thing happen in games. So if anything, we're a bit ahead of the curve, or were. But in both comics and games, we've seen this willingness, this maturity of subject matter and so on. We've seen that retreat. Now, before the Comics Code, a lot of comics were depicting horror in a fairly graphic way. We're dealing with more adult, mature topics. Also, there were a lot more minority creators of various races and whatever else. Even, you know, back in the 30s and 40s, that went away with the Comics Code, and I think we've seen a similar thing happen lately, without it being necessary to enforce it with the Comics Code. At least in comics. I mean, a lot of the new stuff is just internally bad, preachy, cleansed, attempting not to upset anyone, but upsetting the core audience of comics in the meantime. And I think we're seeing a similar push in games. You know, it's a big part of this culture that we live in now. Everything is subject to a political litmus test. It has to be run past the Politburo of blue check marks on Twitter before it can be allowed. Something Moore wrote about sex and sexual violence and so on in comics that seemed particularly apposite that I found. People send me articles on this shit for some reason. So Alan Moore said, well, quite obviously, the safest and most comfortable option would have been to go along with the censorious status quo and simply not refer to sexual matters, even obliquely. Indeed, as I remember, this is exactly the option that most of my contemporaries in the field back then tended to make their default position, since they were understandably reluctant to displease their editors and thus to jeopardize their chances of future employment. It seemed to me, however, that if comics could not address adult matters, by which I meant a great deal more than simply sexual issues, then they could never progress to become a serious and accepted artistic medium, and would never amount to anything much more than a nostalgic hobby for aging teenagers. To my mind, the only mind I had direct access to, it seemed that such a potentially astonishing medium deserved more than this. Along with political and social issues, I elected to make sexual issues a part of my work. So perhaps it is the next decision that I made wherein I am at fault. My thinking was that sexual violence, including rape and domestic abuse, should also feature in my work where necessary or appropriate to a given narrative, the alternative being to imply that these things did not exist or weren't happening. I think I've quoted that before, but I've been meditating, I guess, on it a lot. Now, my ambition, I guess, and I know I'm kind of losing faith with a few of the people that hang around. My ambition is for role-playing games to be potentially taken seriously as an art form, even if it's folk art, even if your only audience is your players and so on. I want to be able to tackle complex political, social, sexual and other issues in the games that I write, in the games that I edit and produce, in the games that I am art director or creative director for, and in the games that I run. And the prevailing attitude seems to be that this shouldn't be done. It shouldn't even be discussed. It's not possible to do well, though that's a subjective judgment, and I think you should be free to do these things badly so that other people can be free to do them well. You know, there's nothing universal about a perception of quality or whatever. I mean, exploitation films of the 70s and 80s and that sort, they're now regarded as classics of cinema, but many of them. But if the freedom wasn't there to make these things that were deemed exploitative or whatever else, and quite often seen quite tame by modern standards, though I guess that's changing as modern standards regress. You know, without that you wouldn't have those. Sturgeon's law applies. 90% of anything is crap, but then that 10% is good. So I want to be able to be free to examine the idea of torture or rape or murder, or and again, a lot of these things do not raise the slightest eyebrow. Murder and torture is pretty, you know, that's any given day of the week in a lot of games, even dungeon bashes where everyone's good. You know, there's nothing more dangerous or more horrendous than a righteous man convinced he's doing the right thing, which is why paladins get away with so much a lot of the time in base D&D and so on. But there's this idea that exploring these topics must necessarily be abusive, that it must necessarily be harmful or damaging to anyone that plays it. This, after we spent decades arguing the exact opposite to the people who were trying to tell us that the games would make us kill ourselves, or that they were paths to the occult, or that they were, you know, imparting real infernal secrets that would imperil our very souls or whatever. You know, we spent so long, and the science backed it up, showing that there is a disconnect between the person and their character, that role players more than anyone, or at least used to, understand the difference between reality and fantasy. And now we've got people within the community trying to police the community, saying that there is no difference between reality and fantasy, that you can't explore something in the realm of your imagination that you never would in reality. And obviously the main sticking point is sexual violence, which is why I tend to bring it up and talk about it a lot. It's just that's the one that makes people think and understand and question how this all fits together. It's estimated that about 2/3 of women have rape fantasies. Does that mean that 2/3 of women secretly want to be raped? No, of course it doesn't. And a lot of people have a very complex and difficult relationship with their fantasies. But they're just fantasies. It doesn't mean you want this to happen to you. It doesn't mean you want someone to do it to you. You have this kind of romanticized idyll in your head of what it might be. of the forceful and passionate lover who overcomes your misgivings or whatever. You know, bodice rippers. It's a whole genre. I think every part of human experience should be available to artists, writers, creators, games masters, players to examine and explore. Now, yeah, this should be negotiated to an extent. If you have a regular group, you learn their limits and understandings as you go along. The only place this should ever really cause a big problem is in open games, at conventions and so on. And the rating system seems to me to be more than adequate for that. But if people are getting this much more sensitive, then perhaps we need an X rating as well, or an adult area for gaming. But the answer is not, and cannot be, to cut off any and all examination of these topics, you know, whether done well or not, whether done gently or not, whether done sensitively or not, whether done exploitatively or not. Yeah, the right to free expression doesn't end because one person might be upset by it in a particular context. You know, when your character dies, you don't die. When something horrible happens to your character, it doesn't happen to you. The question is, how does your character react? How does the world react? What makes sense as a consequence of whatever has happened to your character? And in horror games especially, agency will be taken away from your character. You'll be rendered unconscious, or captured, or tortured, or infected, or whatever else it might be. That's the nature of horror. It is the loss of agency. It is the inability to really necessarily make a difference to the world around you. Whether you're fighting the undead psychopath who's risen from the bottom of the lake, or the hunt club of torture enthusiasts, or whatever else it might be. It's kind of one of the defining features of the genre, is the loss of agency, the narrowing of choices. I mean, I'm not that off base, am I, in thinking that gaming can and should tackle difficult and adult subjects, should tackle politics without being preachy, of course. But, you know, if you want to be preachy, knock yourself out. It's just, you're not going to find much of an audience. This hypersensitivity, this no blackleaf that people get into, it just doesn't. I don't understand where it has come from, particularly given the history and nature of the hobby. It's a betrayal. It's a betrayal. Zang.